Cool. So yeah, this is going to be like sort of the bonus class, but I also think like the more I did it, the more I was like, this should really just be a part of the normal class schedule because we'll be looking at like a lot of tools of things you can do in Photoshop or in other in Illustrator as well. So I think this might be a good class to just talk about like if you really want to get into the nitty gritty of like making a data set, like you're going to end up touching Photoshop and playing with things. So we'll sort of walk through a bunch of tools in this class. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And if we don't take up the full hour and a half, we can have a little bit of time at the end to just maybe talk about some of the stuff we're working on, and we can talk about whatever people want to talk about. Cool. So couple notes for folks. If you haven't scheduled a one-on-one yet with me, I know I talked to Stephen already, but feel free to sign up for a one-on-one or attend our co-working sessions, especially if you're working on something you want a little bit of one-on-one help with it. So I linked again in the Slack channel to Leah and Maya's Calendlies. Feel free to sign up and take advantage of those. This is the last week of class, so Leah has already sent out the end of class survey. So please feel free to fill that out with as much positive or negative feedback as you want to. Leah and I do try to like really take that feedback into consideration, and I know Naoko and I have already talked about what's like she found helpful this time since she's taken a bunch of classes already. She can sort of compare apples to apples and sort of say I like this better or this better. Yeah, we really appreciate the feedback, and as we've all been talking about, like we will probably be doing classes again next year. I think the Style Gang class next month will probably be like the last, or actually it starts next week already, geez. Will probably be like the last class for our courses for the year, just because November and December get kind of crazy. And also Lee and I have been teaching like almost nonstop since January, it feels like. So I think we deserve a little break for ourselves. But we will probably do more courses again in the next year. So if people have topics they're interested in, or just like, hey, I wish you would explore more of this sort of area, we're happy to take that feedback and put it toward next classes. So actually, we'll probably skip the breakout session since there's only like 5 of us here. But if people want to talk about what they're working on at the end of class, that'd be really fun to hear about. So we'll be talking a little bit about some like tools that I use in Photoshop to make things a little bit more efficient for myself. I do a lot of my work in Photoshop, cleaning things up, straightening things, that sort of thing. So I'll show you some of the tools that I use, and maybe that'll help give people some ideas. And then we'll look at actions, which I think are like, probably like the bare minimum of what you might want to start playing with to figure out what you're doing. And then we'll talk a little bit more about scripting. So scripting is like a much bigger topic, and also like kind of a dark art in Adobe script, in the Adobe world. So I've done a lot of it in previous careers or previous lives. So I can talk a little bit about what I've learned works. It's definitely not it's not for the light of heart. It's a pretty big challenge, but I think just sort of seeing what I'm working on or how others work might help give you some like direction on things. Then we'll do a break, and then we'll look at some examples of Photoshop and Illustrator scripting, because I think actually seeing the examples is probably like the most important thing, because it's really hard to understand how you do it until you see how other people do it. So I'll point out, so Esteban has shared some examples with me. I've got a bunch of other examples that I'll share with folks. And I would definitely recommend maybe the starting point is just to like dig into other people's scripts and like see how they work, and then go from there. And then we'll do a Q&A. Cool. So Photoshop, as I mentioned, like scraping and cropping using dataset tools probably isn't enough at some point. At some point, you're going to get like a data set of scans, and the scans will be kind of messy, and you'll want to figure out how to clean them up. And eventually that means you probably end up in Photoshop. I'm sure like tools like GIMP and other like open source like Photoshop tools will get you some of the way there. But some of the things that I'll show you in Photoshop are going to be like the much better like versions of a lot of tools. Like, Adobe does, as much as people shit on Adobe, there's a lot of things that Adobe does really well, and some of those are like computer vision tools that make your process a little bit faster if you're aware of them. So I'll go through some of those in just a minute. Yeah, so here are some of the tools. Also, Bug is taken today to be like really loud, so if you hear yelling and screaming, sorry, I'll hold her at some point, but I also need to do demos with my hands, so we'll see how this goes. So some tools that I find in Photoshop that are like really, really helpful and much better than like trying to do it in Python or whatever. Here's a list of them. So any of the content-aware tools. So there is content-aware fill, there's content-aware scale, there's a couple other content-aware tools. So you might think that those are machine learning tools, and they're actually not. They are, there's really, really smart algorithms that allow you, that sort of like make when you're doing like content aware scaling, it figures out where to scale something and where not to. In terms of content aware fill, it figures out sort of like edges and does some edge detection to figure out what should be filled in. So they feel really, really smart, but they are, whoops. So they feel really, really smart, but they're not actually machine learning. They're just like really, really advanced computer vision tools. The stamp tool, I'll show an example. I'll just walk through a demo of like how I would clean up an image, like that sort of thing. If you've never used a stamp tool before, it's probably like one of the nicer tools, especially if you're looking for things like textures. There are actually some ML machine learning tools inside of Photoshop. Adobe over the past year or two has been adding sort of new tools here and there to like help with things. There's an upres tool, which I'll show folks how to use. There's also like an object selection tool, which works hit or miss, but it exists. The crop tools are really helpful. I tend to use them a lot, and they're a little bit smarter than say like, trying to figure out how to do shit in dataset tools, which is not that smart, but maybe eventually will be smarter. And then lastly, we'll look at actions, and I think actions are sort of like one of those things where because we work at scale, it's probably like really helpful to start to think about how you can turn things into actions so that you can sort of like one-click your way into some solutions. So one thing to know is that a lot of these tools, because they're sort of like off the beaten path of Photoshop, either don't have key commands to them or they are really, really long key commands, like adding like 4 or 5 buttons to click. I've installed this tool called BetterTouchTool on my computer, which basically turns your touch bar into like a sort of a superpower. You can assign a lot of really long key commands to a one-click button on your touch bar. So if you use a Mac laptop and you have a touch bar, it's like kind of a fun thing to do, helpful to use. You can also try to like move around your key commands, which I find that sometimes the key commands break very easily if you're like Photoshop like corrupts or something. So sometimes it can be a bit of a challenge. So I try not to like go too overboard because sometimes I will lose these things. So I can't show you what my touch bar looks like. This is what the touch bar tool looks like. It basically adds like this toolbar menu to your touch bar. You can assign it various commands. So the 2 commands that I sort of use almost every day, anytime I'm cleaning up a data set, is the crop tool and the content aware fill tool, which I'll do a demo of in just a minute. But I have these assigned to these touch bar tools. So again, instead of trying to like remember like doing like a weird crab finger thing and trying to remember all the keys, I just assign it to a one-click key and then I can touch that key and it works. So BetterTouchTool is free for like 90 days, and I think it's like $8 like in total, like it's a one-time fee. And then I think it's like gives you like 2 years of updates or something. So it's fairly inexpensive. And honestly, it saves me like probably like a couple minutes per image. So like I think it's totally valuable to use. There's a link to it here if you're interested in checking it out. Cool, so let me just do a quick demo of like how I actually use these tools. So let me first pull up BetterTouchTool. So in BetterTouchTool, you have like sort of along the left-hand side here are your applications. You'll see here in Photoshop, I have the crop tool and I have the content aware fill tool, and these are mapped to some custom key commands. So like this is like 5 keys, right? It's like Shift, Control, Option, Command, C, which like I never want to like try to remember. So I just map these to these buttons, and I like, again, as you build up a bunch of buttons, you might want to like just assign like an emoji or some icon to your keys so that we have more keys available to you in your touch bar. So let me just show, like, this is sort of how I work in Photoshop. So let's say I have an image like this. This is literally a scan from a book. I'm going to need to do a lot of cleanup work to get this into like a decent data set format. First thing I usually do is there's some sort of cropping or straightening tool. So the crop and straighten tools are over here. I really like this straighten button, which allows you to basically just draw a line on the page, and that gives you like a straight line for that edge. So in this case, I'm just going to grab this and move this here. You'll see it's saying it's rotating at -0.1 degrees. Some of my scans are really messy and they need a lot more than that. But I find this is just a nice way to create a nice crop that aligns to like some sort of line. Once that's here, then you have like this sort of cropping tool. Sometimes the edges are really messy and I need to like actually extend the artboard, which you can do. And then you just hit return and it crops it. So that's sort of the first tool I use. From here, it's just a lot of like, how do I want to clean up this image? One thing I also tend to use the lasso tool a lot. I find that like with a lot of these, because I'm downsampling them pretty small, it doesn't really matter how precise I am, right? Like you can be as precise as you want to be, and like some people get really into being precise in Photoshop. I tend to keep it kind of loose. One thing I'll generally do is just sort of like grab a bunch of these edges and look at how the content aware fill tool works. So I can just select this edge, because basically what I want to do is I want to extend this a little bit wider, because I don't love like how closely cropped these pieces of art are. So I'll just come in here. And then the key command for inverse, because I just want everything that's inverted, is Shift Command I, or select, modify inverse, or select inverse. Again, like this is sort of like after doing this many times watching TV, I feel like I can do it with my eyes closed. I'm going to go ahead and hit the content aware fill tool. And what's going to happen over here is you'll see that it's now going to try to calculate how to fill out this image, right? And you'll see it like kind of did okay. Oops, let's see if this works still. So it filled in some of the flower over here. It fills in like basically what it does is wherever there's an edge, so you'll see in this box, it's sort of touching this. It's going to try to like complete this using the other things it sees around it. And this is how you can tell that it's not a machine learning tool, because it doesn't actually generate new content. It just sort of takes the textures that are already around in the image and applies them again. But it does it in a way that's actually like sort of really nice, and that you can't really tell that like, oh, this thing is clearly like a, you know, it's not just duplicating it like the stamp tool does, but it's sort of like cleaning up things in a way that's a little bit nicer than that. So one thing to note is that you can actually do some editing of this. So let me just back out here a little bit. So if I don't like how this looks, and let's say I just want to get more of that paper texture and I don't want to get the flowers as much, one thing you can do is you can use the plus and minus buttons up here. And if you use the minus button, it will actually remove, this is basically removing it from the sampling area. So basically I'm saying don't take any of the texture from this flower. And as it updates, it starts to pull in texture from other places. Now you'll notice this almost got worse because it didn't know how to look around this image, but now you can sort of apply this all over the place, right? So you can just take out this heart flower. There's also a huge image, so it's like kind of a little slow because it's dealing with a lot of pixels. But if I take out that, chill out, bug. So, okay, so now this is like, we're slowly getting worse, but it's actually getting better because I can now just start to remove all this. And if I were to come in here and just remove all of the flower, like every flower I see in here, the hope is that it's just gonna pick up the paper texture. And I do find it works fairly well. It starts to get a little like noisy or bit rotty a little bit as you do this more and more in more places. And I probably won't spend all day, like the entire class doing this, but I'll just sort of show you that as you clean this up, it gets a little better. Take out that, take out that, take out this. So now, obviously you don't want to do this with every single image. And I must say like this particular image is pretty bad for this. Like other images work much better, or like because they have a little bit more border in them, there's less of an issue here. This is going to just be a particularly egregious one. I would also say like, because this is really high res, I really like these images and I might actually cut them up into multiple images. So it's kind of like, this is worth my time to like go in and actually do this work. But in some cases for other data sets, it's probably not. I'm just gonna remove this here real quick. And then we'll just see what sort of happens with this, and then I'll just call it a day. Can you hear Bug screaming the entire time? Shit, okay. I don't have doors on any of my rooms, so it's like really hard to like lock her out. But okay, you'll see here, so like now this is much nicer than it was before. You'll see there's like sort of some noise being generated up here, that sort of thing. But I feel like this is probably good enough for me to get moving with, so I'll just hit okay. So that's the content aware fill tool. There's also a content aware brush, which I will probably use a little bit on some of these images. It's going to take a little while for this one to churn out. Okay.
What is the resolution of this image?
This is probably like a 3 or 4K image, so it's like huge. And so like Photoshop is very mad at me. If I'd been smarter, I would have shrunk this down so we could do this demo. I will probably do that in the next step actually, just to save myself some time. There we go. Okay, so it's done. Let's actually take a look and see what the resolution is. Yeah, okay, so not 10,000 pixels tall, so that's way too big. Let's just make this a little bit smaller for this demo. Okay, so let me just show you a couple other tools in here that I use, which is we can look at the stamp tool. So one thing you'll notice here is you get, because the content aware tool is basically a copy and paste tool, you'll see that this texture, this like sort of background, it was like bleeding through the image, sort of keeps showing up in a bunch of places. So let's take a look at the stamp tool. So the stamp tool is this tool over here. Basically, it is set based on how big of a pixel range you want, and I usually leave the hardness a little bit soft, just so that way you don't get hard edges. And then what you do with the stamp tool is you hold down the Option key, and that's going to sample from the area you're in. So if I sample from here, now I can sort of paste this anywhere I want to, right? So this is a nice little area where it's just paper texture, and you can paste this in here. So again, if I were to I would spend a lot more time doing this work, but you can go ahead and just sort of eliminate some of the paper texture here. And you'll see it's going to get a little messy. We'll have to sort of figure that out. But there's just a nice way to sort of remove some area. Now this works in an area where you have like a clear thing that you're trying to remove. But if you look in this place where there's sort of like this crease texture in this flower, I don't really want to go in and try to stamp out just that texture. So this is where I'm going to use the content aware fill brush. So if you click on brush, then you come up here and you click on paint mode. Is that right? This is not right. Well, J. Yes. So spot healing brush is actually what you want. And the spot healing brush should be set the type to content aware. There's a bunch of other filters here, but I use content aware. And what you can do then is you can actually just draw a line over this image. And what it's going to do is it's going to do that content aware, and it's actually going to sort of like catch all the textures nearby it. So it's really nice is that it will remove some of these textures. Now the truth is, like in a StyleGAN data set, oh shit, this probably isn't necessary because like StyleGAN is going to blur a lot of this shit and like sort of like you're going to lose a lot of this textural detail. But if you're really, really like particular about your data sets, like you can try to like remove this stuff and it will work fairly well. Now you'll notice that if like you actually look at this, you're like, I can sort of see where what it did there. So it's not perfect, but again, it might be better than introducing these sort of creases into your data set. Okay, so that is sort of the Photoshop tools that I tend to use the most. Again, I do also have a crop tool where like it's set up for the touch bar. So let's say I just wanted to go in and manually crop all these flowers out. I tend to do something where it's like, I'll just create a bounding box and I hit the crop tool on my better touch bar and it crops it. Again, this is much quicker than, I don't even think crop actually has, what is it, image, crop. I don't think crop actually comes predefined with a key command. It actually just gives you, you have to always manually go to it, which is really annoying. Jesus Christ, bug, chill out. Okay. Had enough of this shit. So you actually have to assign it a key command. So this is again where you want to assign it a key command and then use BetterTouchTool to actually do it. So again, this is sort of a process where like I tend to have a lot of images where there's either 2 or 3 pieces like ganged up together. So actually a lot of my scans, I have a big, huge like 11 by 17 flatbed scanner. So I'll fit up as many pages as I can, and then I'll go in and crop each one of them using this crop tool. And then I might go in and individually clean those up from there. So lots of like helpful little shortcuts where again, like having to like select this box and then go up to image crop, like that might just take you a little bit more time. When you start getting the groove of this stuff, like you'll just want to use key commands and those sort of things. Let's also look at, what was I going to talk about next? I think that covers all of the main tools I use in Photoshop. Are there any questions about any of these?
Not a question, but I think just pressing C brings up the crop menu, doesn't it?
Oh, interesting. Does it? Yes, it does. Again, like that works, but then you still have to hit C and then return. Or like, yeah, return again. So you still have to hit it a bunch of times. Whereas this is just like, it's just assigned to auto crop. It just immediately jumps to cropping it to a square. So yeah, again, it's sort of like, if you want to play with those tools, you can, but it'll add 2 other keystrokes for you. So again, this is sort of where like when I'm watching TV, I just get in the groove of just like do this, hit this button, do this, hit this button, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Do you have an alternative for touch bar? Because I don't have that on my laptop.
There might be, I mean, what I would probably do is I would take your most popular commands and I would reset all of your other. So if Command C, I don't even know, what does Command C do? Oh, I guess Command C is copy. So you might not want to override that one, but you might decide like Command 1 or something is what you want your crop tool to be. You could just reassign your keyboard actions. So actually, let's look at how to do that. So in preferences, and then, actually it's in file, isn't it? It's in edit. It's so ridiculous. It should be in preferences, but instead it's in edit keyboard shortcuts. So you can come in here and you can find any of your commands. So if there's a command you just like never use, you can just override the key command for it. So let me see if there's like one that I never use. I probably never use adaptive wide angle, right? So like, I don't know, I could like delete this and like assign Option Shift A to a different command. That's probably what I recommend doing instead of trying to deal with touch bar. Yeah, but basically like you want to get as close and like be able to do stuff as quickly as possible, especially as you're digging through a bunch of these. So that's one particular option. Any other questions? Cool. So let's look at actions really quickly. I am not the world's best person when it comes to actions, but I will like sort of show you some really simple versions that I use. So one thing that happens pretty often to me is when I'm scraping Instagram, I usually have like, there will usually be like an image. So actually this is a great example. Let me just crop this down really quickly and sort of show you what I mean. So quite often what will happen in Instagram is people will upload images that are square, but they're not really square, right? They'll upload an image that looks like this, and you've got these white borders. A really simple way or a really nice action that I've written in the past is just to remove these white borders using content-aware fill. So if you've never done actions before, I can just sort of quickly show you how actions work. So actions work by, basically you're recording your own steps. And once you record the steps that you follow, then you can apply it to another image. So in this case, we can just go new action. Let's just call it white borders. And we hit record. So now that we've hit record, it's going to record any step I take. So the first thing I want to do is I want to use my magic wand and I want to select anything white. And I'm going to turn off contiguous. So contiguous says only within one region do I want it. If you turn it off, it's going to find all white edges. So I'm going to go ahead and click this. Oh, interesting. What happened there? Maybe I have to make this a layer. Oh, my tolerance is way too high. So that's the other thing is like, now I actually have to realize, this is a problem with actions is once you make a bad step, you kind of have to delete it. So I'm actually gonna hit stop. I'm gonna just delete this entire thing. And once now that I realize what I'm doing wrong here, we'll go create new action. So I'm gonna set the tolerance to like 20. And then I'm gonna come in here and I'm gonna hit select these two borders, and then I'm going to go to select, modify, expand. This is another thing I've just sort of learned is that if you expand your edges by just a little bit, you'll get those little areas that might have like half white pixels on them. And then I'm going to go ahead and hit content aware fill. And I see it also picked up some other areas, which is a little annoying. And I'll hit return. But basically all it's saying is take all the white areas and then apply content aware fill to them. So we'll hit stop. So now I've finished recording this session. Now I could also do like a save for web. You can compound a bunch of these things in here, but basically what I want to do now is let me see if I can find another image here real quickly. Let's just grab this one. And let me just fake this. So let me make this a smaller size. So now I've got this white white edges here again. So if I click on fill borders and I hit play, it's just going to replay all of the selection I did. Oh, interesting. Okay, so what I have to do is actually delete this step. You can also delete these steps and edit them a little bit. Yes, and then we'll play from here again. Ah, are you serious? Okay, so clearly I screwed something up here. I have another one up here that's this other one. This is the one I actually use. We could just run this one and this should work fine. Ah, interesting. Okay, so clearly I screwed something a little bit up here, and that it might not have been contiguous previously. But let's see if this will do it again. Nope. Okay. So, again, writing these actions is a little bit of a challenge. And then we're actually going to look at this in scripting too, where it's like, how ambiguous are you and how non-ambiguous are you? But this is a nice little tool that if you get the settings right, and this is sort of a challenge you have to play with a little bit to make sure it's doing exactly what you expect it to. If you set it up correctly, you will get multiple images. I think the way this one is probably set up is, I think this one was set up for if it was an image that was set like this. Yeah, so that one was set up to work with an image like this. And again, this might not be the look you want to go for, so you might have to tweak your algorithm a little bit to get actions to work. But this is nice in that it just sort of is repeating a pattern you already apply. So if you find that you're doing the same steps over and over again, and you think it's like semi-repeatable in the sense that you're just in click, 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 you can use an action to sort of automate that step. Any questions about actions? I feel like this one might be one that a lot of people know about. Cool. Okay, so that's just like a quick overview of some of the Photoshop tools I use. Let's jump back into talking about scripting. Yeah, so actions are really simple, but it's sort of like multi-step. There's also certain things you can't do with actions, and this is where scripting comes into play. So in the case of scripting, like one of the nice things about it is you can begin to introduce things like logic, like take this image as width and divide it by 2. Photoshop doesn't really have a concept of that, right? An action is going to say like, take this image and make it whatever size you made in your action, whatever you recorded, right? So if you're just trying to divide things by widths, or if you're trying to do if-else statements, like you can't really do that inside of an action. An action is literally just recording what you did and like repeating it. And it's why you saw that like it ran into issues when I like didn't have the same border set up. And this is where a case like a scripting is actually gonna be better. So you can use scripting. Scripting inside of Adobe comes in a couple of flavors. There's ActionScript, there's Visual Basic scripting, and there's JavaScript. Both ActionScript and Visual Basic are like kind of like old. I feel like lots of people don't really write in those languages anymore. So I find that a lot of the community has moved over to JavaScript. And JavaScript, like what's nice about it is it includes the ability to include logic. So doing if-else statements, doing things like if this is larger than this, do this. If it's smaller than this, do this, that sort of thing. You can also name files, which you can't really do in actions. Actions have like it really struggles to sort of deal with file naming. And scripting even includes the ability to chain multiple applications together. So a lot of what I was doing a couple of years ago is I was taking a file in InDesign. I was opening the image asset in Photoshop, cropping to the exact bounds that it was in InDesign, and then saving it back out as like a PSD or like some sort of file to be able to use in PDFs. So you can do really, really complicated chaining among multiple Adobe applications. And this is where it gets really, really powerful. And you can do, I was basically taking a book and running through every page of the book and converting it to individual image assets so then it would build an HTML file for me. So it's like really, really complicated, and it can be really challenging to figure out how all that works, but it's really powerful. Before we get too far into this, I will say that scripting in Adobe is probably one of the most frustrating coding things I've ever experienced in my life. It is definitely not for the faint of heart. If you can get away with an action, just use an action. And if you know something like processing or P5, and you can solve this using P5, I would recommend doing it there. Adobe scripting is very frustrating, and part of it is just because there aren't that many people who are doing it. So just trying to find examples of how other people have done things can be really, really challenging. But since I've been doing it for maybe the past 7 or 8 years, I can give you some things that I've learned that hopefully like you won't have to relearn. So there's a couple of things about scripting. So first off, there are a lot of scripts online that you can download and use. And if you want to just do that, you can run those from anywhere inside of an application itself. But once you want to edit things, you start to need to get like a crazy sort of building tool setups for yourself. So first off, if you just want to run a script, the way to run scripts directly from Photoshop is in File, Scripts, and then Browse. And you can, wherever you download that file, you can go ahead and open up it's usually a .jsx file extension. You can run that script from there. There's also like a pretty convoluted way to like add scripts to this list here by finding a folder inside of your settings and uploading it there. If anyone's interested in that, I'll like provide a link to that. But you can add links to your default scripts. But I've sort of found that like once this gets above like 15 or 20, you've got to start scrolling through that list and it gets really annoying. So I tend to just browse to like find whatever scripts I'm using it. Actually, I tend to use it mostly from Visual Studio Code, but we'll get into that in a second. From Illustrator, it's File, Scripts, and then Other Scripts. Of course, because this is Adobe, they can't have the same menu, but just be aware that like you can do it from both. I think there's also ways to do it in Premiere as well as in After Effects. Like I think almost every Adobe application has some sort of JavaScript DOM background to read from. So the steps to install this, I linked to a video in our Slack channel that walk you through some of the steps, but this one's actually better. I found this other video that has much better steps. So if you want to watch this, I would definitely recommend watching this to get everything installed. They lead you through the process of getting everything set up, which is pretty annoying. You have to use a tool called VS Code, which is Visual Studio Code. It's a thing from Microsoft, but it allows you to set up some things. A year or two ago, there was an Adobe tool called ExtendScript that they use themselves, or that they maintain themselves, and they maintained it very poorly. I have to say I'm glad that it's gone. It is not a good tool. VS Code feels like it's a lot of struggle to get set up, but I actually think it's better than what they used to have. And lastly, like in that video, you'll hear him discuss debugger, script runner, and then running the scripts from the menu. So this is the easiest step. Like you just run a script that you already have exists. It's totally fine. It works. But if you want to actually edit a script, you're probably going to end up using debugger or script runner. And I'll talk about those in just a minute about how they work. But it's important to sort of know the differences and how each one of them operates or doesn't operate. So watch this video if you're interested in getting all this set up. It definitely takes, give yourself a good 30 minutes to get it set up because it does take a little bit of time. So make sure you give yourself time and to sort of like go through the video, go backwards, and like check everything out. So there are, I guess there's two real modes inside of Visual Studio Code to actually run a script. The first is called debugger, and that is from this debugging menu, and you have to create like a custom script to actually run a debugger. It's included, or like it's discussed in this video, but basically you from the debugger menu, you run this command, and it basically runs whatever your script is. The reason you might want to use debugger is debugger allows you to, if you've ever done scripting in like JavaScript or anything, and there's a debug console where you can output things to. So a lot of times you use this command called $.writeLine, which allows you to output like, let's say you're trying to track the file name of something. If for whatever reason the file name isn't coming through correctly, you can send it to the console to make sure that you're getting the right thing. So debugger is the only way for you to actually do debugging and to the console. And that means like, most times you're actually going to run it from here. I find it's a little frustrating, and I find that a lot of times you have to restart both the application and VS Code to get it to work right. So, you know, again, this isn't the perfect tool, but it does work. So I tend to find I use debugger a lot just to sort of like output different pieces of code. Now, the other way to do this is to use what's called script runner. Script runner is another extension you have to install, and I think it's included in that video. And this, you use the Shift-Control-P command, and then you tell it what application you're sending it to. And this is going to take your script and it's going to send it to that application. And we'll get an example of that in a little bit. But just know that like the problem with this is that I think if you include $.writeLine in your code when running this, it either breaks and dies silently or it doesn't work at all. And there's like a bunch of challenges here. So I've sort of discovered this in the past couple of days just doing these things. One thing you can do is instead of $.writeLine, you can use an alert. So if you write alert and then pass in whatever variable you're looking for, it will pop up an alert menu with that command. The problem with that is if you're doing that in a loop, let's say you loop over something 1,000 times and it hits alert, you're gonna have to hit OK on that alert 1,000 times. So it is I would be very careful about using alerts in your scripts because it can also put you in an infinite loop where like you're Adobe application just starts spinning. You have to restart everything. So just be aware of that. This is like challenges you'll run into as you start to make your own scripts. So debugger is probably the safest, but it can be a little annoying. Script runner is the next sort of like safest version, but has some hiccups. And then if you run these scripts directly from the script command inside the application, like file, browse scripts, or whatever, it will definitely throw a bunch of errors if there's anything wrong with your code. And this is the challenge, is like your code has to be very, very clean and like not have errors in it to not run through debugger. Like debugger is the best thing to start with if you're not sure your code is working. The other areas will run into like lots of silent deaths and other things. So it can be really, really challenging. So just be aware of that. I would probably recommend running it through debugger if you have any concerns or if you're just getting started. That's all covered here. So for me personally, I never ever use the file, browse, scripts or whatever. I almost always use scripting pretty much from the script runner command. So I almost always open my code in VS Code and then run it from here. Because of that, there are some ways to do like GUIs and other things within these scripts. I tend to skip that stuff and just stick them in variables. I'll show you an example of this when we get to the demos. You can get really fancy with creating really nice GUIs for these tools, and some people do. I tend to skip that and just go straight to like, here's a variable, edit the variable in this code, and then run it from here. Here are a bunch of must-have scripting tools. Obviously, you need VS Code. Like that's pretty much a must-have at this point. Next is there's a bunch of documentation, and from my experience, these are like the best documents you can look at. And it took me a while to sort of realize how they work and why they are as good as they are, but I definitely recommend them. So I actually already have them open in Acrobat as PDFs. We'll go through an example of this after our break, but these are PDFs that Adobe puts out, and they explain every single property of various components inside of Photoshop or in Illustrator. There's one of these for pretty much every application. So for example, here are the properties of an art layer, and an art layer is essentially a layer of image inside of Photoshop. So if you read through all these properties, you can probably make sense of what they are. Pretty much if I'm doing any scripting, I have this open alongside my scripting, and I'm bouncing back and forth between the two to try to understand what I'm doing. There are some people have sometimes taken these PDFs and converted them to like a website. So there is a website called yearbook.github.io, which is an ExtendScript API. And if you come over here and you set this to Illustrator 24, you'll see almost the exact same thing. Actually, let's set this to Photoshop. You'll see almost the exact same thing over here, which is here's the art layer. And then here are all the various pieces available within these things. So some people like this method, some people like the PDF method. One thing I'll say is that you don't always know how up to date this thing is, right? This is CC 2015. There's probably newer versions of the Photoshop scripting now, like there's 2020 available. So they don't change that much, but they might change just a little bit. So it's sometimes good to just find the latest version and to just use the PDF from there. So one of the things that I found is that the latest version of Illustrator that Adobe released or has available on their website is Illustrator 2017. So this is kind of the challenge of working with Adobe scripting, is like, they're kind of slow. They're like, again, this is not a product that many people are using, so they do not prioritize this work. So I've yet to find something later than Illustrator 2017. Most of the stuff I want to use works in there. They usually add like maybe a couple commands per new release, so it's generally fine. Photoshop is up to date, so this one is up to date on 2020. So you can go ahead and use this one and feel pretty good about this. But this is sort of the challenge of this stuff, is like lots of stuff goes undocumented, and it can be very annoying. Lastly, you're going to use Google. I guarantee you're going to use Google to like try to solve some of these things. Most of the time, you can't just type in, how do I do X in Photoshop? Because then someone just will show you how to do it directly in Photoshop. So you always have to add scripting afterward. So I'll either do X in Photoshop script, or do X in Adobe script, or do X in ExtendScript, or do X in Illustrator script. And I like just sort of dig around and I find lots of stuff that I don't know how it's going to work, and I just try it out. There are not a lot of places where people Google this stuff, or people even post how they learned things. So it can get kind of challenging. And this is why I sort of like, this is not for the faint of heart, but if you're really interested in trying to dig into it, you can. But all this exists if you're interested. But I generally find that like I can get myself to about 50% of the way there between these 4 things. So it is not the best, but it is available to you if you want to use it. Lastly, I've built up a repo of things myself. This actually, until yesterday, wasn't updated for the past 2 years because I've sort of like stopped working on a lot of this stuff. But I added a bunch of new stuff this week. So if you're interested, there's a lot of examples in here. Like if you dig into the AI folder, I just tend to do a lot of stuff in Illustrator. So there are a bunch of commands in here. And we can look at one of these after when we start to do demos. But if you're interested in just sort of like how artboards work, this is a bad example because you can't really read this code in here. But let me open up Visual Studio. So I've opened up Adobe Hut already here in Visual Studio. So if I go into text frames, actually let's go into artboards. So AI artboards. This is not the best comments, but it does sort of like add some, this will give you some examples of code you can look at. So this is how you add a new artboard to your, this is how you add a new artboard in Illustrator. And this is very complicated code. You have to like dig in and figure out what all this means. This is where I would go to the, this is where I would go to Illustrator JavaScript. I would go to object reference, and I would go to artboards, and I would go to artboard methods. And I will see there is actually one artboards. This is another thing we'll talk about is the difference between a singular and a plural. Artboard methods, and then there's add. So this tells you that you need to add it using a rectangular parameter of the class of artboard. That doesn't make any sense to you. I guarantee you it doesn't, because it didn't make any sense to me either. And this is where I've sort of like played around and just sort of figured out like, what does it actually look like? There are some examples, both in, there's actually an example, I believe, at the bottom here. If this will let me go there. Nope, there isn't. So there are sometimes examples that you can find throughout the web or in their own documentation that show you how to do these things. But that example, or like that documentation is really poor, whereas the documentation here in VS Code is much better. So this is sort of the challenge, is you kind of have to decipher what some of these things mean. When I wrote this code, I knew what it meant. When I looked at it again last week, after 2 years, I had no idea what it meant, and I had to go in and try to figure it out again. And I did actually figure it out, and I'll show you some of the things I've learned about that. But essentially, like this exists. So a lot of times what you'll look for is just look for other examples, and you'll try to decipher how those examples work and then apply it to your own work. So just be aware of that. It is a little bit of a challenge. If there's anything that you should understand about ExtendScript, or like if you hear me talk about ExtendScript, that is essentially Adobe scripting, is that there's sort of a document object model, which is that at the very top of the level is the application. So that will either be Photoshop or Illustrator. From there, there's usually preferences or notifier. You don't ever really use those. But then it's documents, right? So Adobe applications are a single application that contains multiple documents. Sometimes you only have one document open. Sometimes you have 10 documents open. But the document holds all of those documents. And then within each of those documents, I think there should be a line drawn here. Within each of those documents, there's all of this stuff. So there's layer comps, there's layer sets, there's art layers, there's path items, there's selections. And you could probably guess what most of these mean, right? Like an art layer is just a layer of imagery. A path layer is a vector layer. A selection is a selection, what you've currently selected on the screen. So all these sort of like trickle down. And that trickle down is actually what you really need to think about and consider when you're writing one of these scripts. A lot of times you're going to start up here and then slowly make your way down here and then slowly make your way down here. So you have to think about that cascade. But this is like the thing to think about, is like how this all works. Similarly, Illustrator has a similar model, which is like application. It's got a thing called text font and a thing called printers that sit off to the side. There's probably, I believe, also preferences, which doesn't exist here because, of course, they can't actually document everything. And then it also moves down to documents. And documents have all of these types of things. So a path item is a vector item. We'll be looking at that a lot. Placed item is an image that's placed on there. There's a mesh item, there's a graph item, there's a compound path item, which is a shape knocked out of another shape. This gets very, very deep. And this is basically the best way to think about the model of how each of these applications work. And in abstract like this, it probably doesn't make sense. But when we actually look at examples of the scripts, I think it'll help make a little more sense. But it's good to sort of like wrap your head around this before you start scripting, because it can be really challenging otherwise to figure out how all this works. Because, for example, artboards aren't even shown on here. So one of the examples we're going to look at later is how to deal with artboards. And artboards don't even exist in here. So you would think that almost the way you might think about it is like documents have artboards, and artboards have all these pieces of content, right? Unfortunately, the way Illustrator thinks about it is artboards are a separate thing that exists alongside documents, but all of these items do not exist in the same place, which is really confusing. Oh, here's artboard. So this can get really, really challenging, and this is sort of the challenge of using scripting. But I'll show you some examples, and hopefully that'll help alleviate some of those pain points there. This is a list of many, many other Illustrator scripts if you're interested, or actually Illustrator, Photoshop, some After Effects as well. Esteban shared some of these with me. Some of these are ones that I'm aware of, but I definitely recommend just sort of like, if you want to get started with this, like digging into a little bit of this and sort of seeing what else is out there. JT Nimoy's Illustrator tutorial, JT Nimoy unfortunately passed away a couple months ago. This is one of my favorite tutorials on how to script in Illustrator, and it basically applies like processing like ideas to Illustrator. So if you're interested in sort of generating art inside of Illustrator, this is a really, really great place to start. It's not super deep. I mean, you can probably do it in about 20, 30 minutes, but this is hands down like one of the best Illustrator tutorials for using scripting if you're interested in actually generating art from it. And then here are just a ton of other scripts options, including looking at all the Adobe scripts on GitHub. So sometimes just dig around and you'll find cool stuff that you can sort of build off of. Sometimes it's just helpful to see examples from other folks. Okay, any questions before we take a break? We're going to go through we're going to go through some example demos in just a minute here. All right, cool. So why don't we take a 5-minute break? So we'll come back at 57 after. Sound good? Okay, cool. See everybody in 5 minutes. All right. Hello, everybody. So I know I'm probably throwing a lot at you. What I would recommend is if you are interested in getting started with this, first off, let's go through the demos that I'll go through in just a minute. But you'll want to come back to that sort of like scripting section and probably rewatch it or like download some of the stuff and watch it while you read through things. Because I hope that those tips there will sort of like get you started. And it probably doesn't make any sense right now until you actually see like how it all works. So hopefully the demos can help with this. Any questions before I jump into the demos? And Bug is back. There was like 5 minutes where she had left me alone. So I'm gonna grab her real quick. Come on, come on. You know, all my summer classes were going great because she was hanging out outside, but now that it's cold, she like wants to come and hang out again. So it goes. Okay, so let's jump into some of these demos. So both of these demos are linked to, the actual JavaScript file is linked to from the deck. So if you want to play with them and just sort of download them and see if you can tweak them yourself, that's usually a good way to get started. Just like try it by starting to tweak someone else's demo. So yeah, 1 second, I see. Oh, okay, 1 second. Cool, so yes, let's get started. So let's start by looking at the, let's just start by looking at the Photoshop script. So this happens to be something that Naoko shared with me, which is, there's this really nice data set there, or like pseudo data set that she had, which was, I believe these are Ecabana flowers. And if you look at them, let's actually just look at the parts first. So this data set included this. So let's show this. So it's just the data set of these sort of like black and white. There's pottery and vases, and then there's these plants that hang out from here. And there weren't that many in this data set. I think there were probably something like, 20 images, which you might think is like, that's gonna be a challenge to turn into a data set, right? Because we know we need hundreds of images. But one thing I'd like about this idea is that you could almost separate out the flowers or the plants from the vases themselves. So what I did is I wrote a really quick little script to actually do that. So basically, well, not to separate them. I had to separate them manually. So what I ended up doing is I ended up separating them manually. So I just did like a little bit of a crop use the lasso tool to crop these and feather the edges a little bit. So I separate out the tops from the vases. And the vases took a little bit more work because I actually needed to like sort of Photoshop in the backgrounds, right? So if there's a background to this, I had to like sort of figure out how to, you know, put the background of the vase of it. And if you look at this close enough, you'll see it's not the cleanest edge, but it does sort of work. So what I want to do actually is I want to generate a script that combines all of the different plants with all the different vases, right? Now, in reality, this might not work as the best StyleGAN data set, but it is a data set that exists in that a sense of like, it'll get me more of the way there, right? So if you have 10 images of vases and 10 images of plants, and you combine those like iteratively, you'll get 100 images. So like now we're starting to build up an interesting data set, and I think this is probably a way that we could think about maybe building up bigger data sets in general is like this idea of collaging them or combining things. So maybe I find a whole bunch of vases, like black and white drawn vases, and I just pull those in, and I find a whole bunch of black and white plants, and I pull them in all in the same way. I could almost like generate an infinite amount of data sets just through those images, right? And maybe some of them are not purely from this data set, but we start to combine things together in an interesting way. Okay, move, thank you. One thing I want to note here is that what's really helpful for this particular script is the way I've set this up is if I turn on my rulers, you'll notice that all of the vases, the very center of this vase is in the exact same position. And if I go to my plants, all of my plants start in the exact same position with a little bit of wiggle. So I've sort of set up this structure, which is definitely going to take me a little bit of time. I've set this up so that they overlap sort of perfectly in the same place every time. That's really, really key for something like this because you know, you can't run some algorithm to check to see where the center of the vase is. So in many cases, I had to like move the vases around. I had to move them up or down or left, right to get them to center here. So just be aware of that is sort of like the manual setup of this thing. So now I've got all my pieces set up here. I saved all these individually out into folders. So in this case, I've got a folder of plants, and you'll see it here, I only have a couple of these, and they're transparent PNGs. And I've got a folder of vases. And so I've got 6 and 5. This is going to create like 30 images in total, right? So what I did is now I've written a script that can grab from this folder and grab from this folder and generate all those images individually. So let's take a look at that script. So the script is here. So the way this is set up is basically it's going to ask you, when you start the script, it's going to ask you for the first folder and the second folder, and then it's going to ask you for an output folder. So you're going to sort of set up your folders before you generate your images. We're then going to run through that first folder, and we're going to say, okay, for the image in here, let's open it, and let's go through all the plant images and add each one of them individually and save it out. So we're going to go through that entire process here, and you'll sort of see that if you read this code, we can actually read this code. So basically, we're just going to ask you for folders. So once we have those folders, we're going to then get all the files inside that folder. And then we are going to loop through the file in the first folders, right? So we're going to work through our vases, and then we're going to open one vase, and then we're going to open up all of the individual plants, and we're going to place them one by one in that file. And then we're going to close everything out, and then we're going to open up that second vase, and we're going to place all of the images in there. So you'll see this goes F1 is our first folder. So we'll open the file. We will set it to be the active document. This is a very common technique. You'll need to set things to active document to make it sort of in the window. And then we'll just grab the name of it because we're going to use this to name all of our files. And then we're going to loop through our second folder, which is all of our plants. We're going to open that. We're going to set that to be active. We're going to duplicate that layer into our first document. So again, this is something where like you might try to copy and paste, and I actually found that copy and paste didn't work. Because copy and paste copies your artwork to the center of the screen. Whereas what I literally want to do is I want to take that entire file and I just want to duplicate it, or I want to take that layer and I want to duplicate it over, which means it keeps its position. So this is basically saying duplicate this layer into the first document, which is my vases document. And then we're going to close out this file. So we're going to close out this file, sorry, the plant file. And then we're going to, I'll show transforms in a second because that's a nice little additional technique that we can do to add some randomness to our file. But we're actually just going to come in and we're just going to, once we've laid that file in, we're going to need to create a file name. And the way I created that file name is by taking the first file name, so like vase1, and then append plant1 to it, and that gives us our file name. This is then the code to actually export the file. So we export this out as a PNG. A bunch of the options up here are up here. So this is going to be saved out as a PNG 16 or 24, I forget which it is, but it's basically not PNG 8, and we don't want any transparency. So you could play with these values if you're trying to get something else out of your data set. And then once it is once that plant is included, we then want to delete that plant. So we're actually going to remove it from that file, and then we're going to grab our second plant, and we're going to do it all over again, right? So by doing this, if we had to do this by hand, this would be very, very annoying, and it's very likely we would forget a file, or like someone would be messed up in the wrong place, like that sort of thing. So this sort of removes the human element because it's still like very static and very step through. It removes the human element and does it very quickly. So I'm going to go ahead and run this, and we can take a look at how this works. So because it's already set up to work the way I want it to, I'm actually just going to use Script Runner. So I'm going to do Shift Command P, and I'm going to say Photoshop. And now Photoshop pops up with this alert that says select your first folder. So I'm going to go to my desktop, and I'm going to set Ekabana, and I'm going to set my first folder. So it's important to remember that order of operations does kind of matter here, because Vases has no it has no transparent part of it. I want to make sure Vases is my base. So I'm going to set Vases to be the first folder. I'm going to set Plants to be my second folder. And then my output folder is, let's actually just make a new output here. We'll call it output no transform. And I hit open, and now it's going to start running. And this shouldn't take more than a couple minutes. Oh, actually, it's probably already doing transforms. Okay, well, that's fine. So you'll see, like, you can actually see it operating, right? It's opening this file, it's doing some things, it's closing the file. It's opening the file. It's like, this is sort of what's nice, is you can kind of watch it work. And a really strong tip I have for you is like start with a very small amount of files. So maybe start with one file in each folder. That way if it breaks, like you're not like spinning through many, many files. So start small. And then what I would probably do next after this is I would actually go in and I would do this for a bunch of other images. Maybe 20, maybe 100, maybe 50. And that would give me the entire process. So let's go and take a look at what happened here. So this is now named wrong, but so it goes. So I come in here and I open these. You'll see I got that vase with different flowers. I got this vase with different flowers. So it worked. So you could apply this to pretty much any two files you have. If their base file only has flat artwork and no transparency, and your top file has transparency in it, you could basically apply this to any file as long as the files are the same size and they sort of match up, again, sort of that onion skin idea. You'll notice that this does actually something different than what I was expecting it to, which is because I have transforms turned on. So what am I doing with transforms? So in transforms, and we'll see this in the Illustrator example as well, I'm actually doing some sort of random applications. So the first thing is I'm applying a blend mode to that top layer. So this is applying a darker color, which is a blend mode, which allows me to basically remove all of that transparent artwork. And maybe you want that, maybe you don't. It's going to kind of depend on the artwork you have. The next thing I'm doing is applying a random rotation. So if you've never messed with math.random, it's like kind of a whole world in and of itself. But basically this creates a random number and then it multiplies it by 10 and then it subtracts 5. So this is going to give me a random number between -5 and 5. And that is how many degrees I want to rotate this thing. Now, it turns out because this artwork isn't centered perfectly at the center of the page, rotation gets a little funky because it rotates it from the center of the screen. So I had to make my numbers a little bit smaller than I might. If I were to redo this, I'd probably reset all of my artwork so that that point where it connects is actually right at the center of the screen. So I might rebuild my base files in that way so that this would always work a little bit better. So it will then apply a random rotation to that image, which is nice because then, again, if you think about how StyleGAN works, you don't really want perfectly overlapped things because then it's going to sort of like memorize it. So this will give you slight differentiations in the way that the image works, which will maybe train a little bit better. That's my theory. I have no idea if that's actually true, but that's sort of a working theory. So that is sort of basically this script. You could apply this to anything. And as you'll see here is I've got this variable in here called transforms, and it's set to true. We set this to false, and then I run this again. And we'll set this Ekabana to vases, plants, and then output no transform really, because it's a great name. We should see that this time these will select. We'll see that this does not include any darker functionality. So you'll see it has a little bit of an edge to this. I don't actually know how to stop this script in I don't know if I can. So we'll just let it run for a minute. While this runs, any questions?
So you said that this probably wouldn't be ideal for style guide, but did you bring that up because of the small data set, or was there a different reason?
So, I mean, I think this actually would be good for StyleGAN, but I would need way more data. And this is a case of where I would probably want to go, like I was just saying, I would probably want to go find a bunch more vases and a bunch more black and white plants and sort of set it up to be this setting, right? What's nice about this is that I do, like this does generate, I made 10 files and it generated 30 files for me. So like in that case, it is really good, but I definitely need more data, right? So it's like 10 by 10 is 100. So I would need 100 by 100 to create that 1,000. No, that doesn't make, is that right? That's 10,000, right? 100 by 100. Anyway, whatever the math is, you would need to figure that out. So like, it's just important to sort of like keep that in mind, is that you still need to generate a lot more data for this. And this is also gonna be true of the Illustrator example we'll look at, which is gonna take vectors on artboards and sort of do the same thing. So just be aware that like you do sort of still have to make a decent data set in order to even multiply this. Now, I would actually say like, I think one thing we could even do with this is we could also think about how can we scale that actual image, the image itself, right? So if I were to set up an artboard that, I think right now these are 768 by 1024, if I were to make that the images like 1400 by 1400, I could also output like individual like scaled down versions, right? So you could almost do like a random scale to crop in on that image. And that's something we've heard that works fairly well with StyleGAN as well. So that like, I could also add that to my script and then I could generate like even more images. At some point, having too much of the same is going to probably have it overfit, but we could sort of play with this and sort of see what works. And what's nice about this is like, again, I don't need to do it all manually, right? I don't need to like set up some like convoluted sort of like comp layer thing. I can just make some tweaks to the way that the script builds and generate a new folder, and I can have it output different things. And I can try those different things on StyleGAN. So that's sort of why I like this technique, because it really does start to begin. I can do tweaks, and like the longest, it took what, like 2 or 3 minutes to run that script. I could start to run that more and more on other data sets. And generally I recommend starting small just because, as you saw, I couldn't really close that file. So like if I start with 1,000 images and it ends up being wrong, I'm gonna end up in like a nightmare zone of just waiting hours for this thing to finish. So just be aware of that. And I should also say like this, the longer you get, the longer the files take. So it does get really complicated the longer, the more data you have. So just be aware of that. I tend to start very small and then build up from there. So if we look at these, you'll see, go for it. Yeah.
How random it could be? Like, could you make it loose, like placing shapes and, well, basically 2 documents randomly, like endlessly, or?
Yeah, so I'll show an example of that in the Illustrator example, which will be next. For this particular data set, it doesn't really make sense to do it too random, because if you do it too random, then the plant is going to end up like out here, right? So it just sort of depends on your data set. And you'll see example here, like this is a case of where like I probably want to use that darken, because I don't love that this is probably because of that rotation. It's rotating too much. So again, you sort of have to tweak this and play with it a little bit. So maybe I want to reduce the amount of rotation I see here, or I just want to make the vase a little bit bigger so it has a little bit more space to fit in, because this isn't the prettiest thing. Now, the other truth is that StyleGAN is going to kind of StyleGAN is going to blur a lot of this stuff. So it doesn't really matter if like 1 or 2 images are not perfect, because StyleGAN is just going to take it all and sort of like glob it all together. So don't get too worried about individual images, but it is still something to think about, is like, if you're seeing a lot of images overfitting or overstepping this space, you might want to think about how to tweak that a little bit. Any other questions about this particular Photoshop script? Cool. One thing I should also note is, let me just go to the script here real quick. If you don't want to go through so this actually loops through every file inside of this folder. Let's say you've built up 100 and you want to actually go back and demo something. You can switch this if you're not familiar with for loops. A for loop basically says start at 0, give me a count all the way up to however many files are in here, and then iterate by 1. If you wanted to change it to just be 1 image, you could switch this to 1. That's a nice technique to sort of like simplify your work if you're doing some debugging. Cool. Okay, so let's take a look at the Illustrator script. So I'm going to go ahead and open up Illustrator. So I already have what's called my collage test here. So let me just talk about what I'm sort of doing. Again, this is just a different technique compared to Photoshop, right? Photoshop, I might be working through folders. I could also iterate through layers if I want to stick everything in one file, but I find that gets a little bit confusing because you have to iterate through layers, which doesn't always make sense. So sometimes working with folders in Photoshop tends to make more sense. But in this script, I have a bunch of various shapes here in Illustrator. And it doesn't matter. I stuck these all the way at the top of this artboard. It doesn't actually matter because it doesn't really care. But if you were to do like, I don't know, Esteban, if you have 10,000 shapes or whatever you're working with, and they're all on an individual artboard, it might get kind of crazy. But I started here just in case we need all that space. But let's take a look at what these shapes are. So I've got 3 vector shapes. One is up here in the top left, one is here in the center, and one is here at the bottom. They're different types of shapes, different colors. I also have a placed image in here. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to sort of, this is I think what Esteban is alluding to is, can I take all these shapes and sort of randomly combine them in different orders? So obviously I would probably want to work with, say, like 100 shapes. Working with only 4 shapes is going to give me pretty limited results. But if I had 100 built up, I could actually run this script and it would still work this way. So to start with, what we're going to do is we're just going to take them in their current position, and we're just going to pick 3 of them to randomly put into a new artboard. So, you know, of this, we'll pick 3 of the 4 and we'll apply them. So let me just pull up that script really quickly and show you how this works. So inside of Adobe Hut, inside of Illustrator, we have a file called Vector Collage. Just take a sip of water here real quick. So this script is a little more complicated, and that's partly because of how Illustrator works with artboards. At the top here, I have a bunch of variables. So the first variable is how many assets do I want to generate? How many artboards do I want to create? So because this is a short demo, I'm going to keep this small. You could make this much, much larger and it would still work. It's just going to take longer to produce. So I'm going to actually make this, 25 just to save us some time. The next variable is how many do I want to produce per artboard? So I'm going to take, actually I'm going to turn this to 2 because it'll be a little bit clearer of like sort of what's working here and what's not. So I'm going to take, of the 4 assets, I'm going to randomly pick 2 of them and put that on a new artboard. I'm going to turn transforms off for now just to sort of like show what it looks like without transforms, and then we'll get to your question about how to transform stuff more crazily, Esteban. Okay, so what's going to happen here? So we're going to go through, and I've tried to document this fairly well. First thing we need to do is we need to get the dimensions of the artboard. So I've made all my artboards 1024 by 1024. In general, I would say make your artboards the exact same size, and probably make them to the pixel size you want. There's a downside to this, which is that the Illustrator has like a max size of a page, right? So a page can fit many, many artboards in it, or a document can fit many, many artboards in it. But the max they allow is 16,344 pixels. So a 10,024 pixel by 10,024 pixel, you can only fit so many on a page. So I wrote some very complicated logic here to make our artboards, which includes making multiple documents. If you go above some like 255, you're going to have multiple documents open. An example of this if we have time at the end, just to sort of show it does work scaled up quite a lot. But this is some fairly complicated code that took me quite a while to figure out. I would recommend if you want to do more stuff like this, you take a look at this code and maybe try to duplicate it. Step 3, we're going to actually go in and we're going to get the art on each artboard. Here again, this is where I ran into an issue, which is like Illustrator doesn't think about art on artboards. It thinks about art in a document, and then it also has artboards along the side. So what you have to do is you have to activate an artboard, then you have to select all of the art in that artboard, and then you have to copy it. So this can get very, very complicated. And then basically we're going to stick that in an array. So if you're not familiar with an array is just like a list of things. So basically we're going to take all of the individual pieces of art in that first artboard, and we're going to stick it in an array to hold, and then we're going to eventually loop through all of our art and generally randomly pick one of these things and apply it. So that's what this step does. So this step says for however many boards we're going to produce, we want to pick our artboard. This is again very, very complicated because you don't place art in an artboard, you place art on a document, and you have to know where the artboard is. We need to make sure we're tracking the latest document. Then we need to activate that document, and then we need to figure out the bunch of positioning stuff here. If you're really, really interested in like the depth of this code, I'm happy to walk through it. But this should just sort of work for you out of the box, but it gets a little complicated here. So next is we're going to loop through how many individual pieces we're grabbing, right? What we're going to do is we're going to grab a random vector or a random path using this code. So basically it's math.random times however many pieces are in that code. And then we're going to select the floor of it, which basically says like we want the 0 index, 1 index, 2 index, or 3 index, right? Because there's only 4 pieces in here. We're then going to duplicate that over to the new artboard or the new document. We're going to make sure the position is correct. This is like, this took me 3 hours of like banging my head against the wall to figure it out. It is undocumented, but basically duplicate in Photoshop duplicates perfectly exactly the position. Duplicate in Illustrator does not keep track of the position, so I had to go back and grab the position from the previous frame, which is a nightmare. Anyway, that's all fixed for you now. You don't need to worry about that, but basically that was, I'm going to complain about that to someone because it was a huge headache. We're going to skip over the transforms and we'll come back to it. Once we've done all that, we're going to actually need to clean up our files, which is a whole other thing. We're actually going to need to remove some stuff from the previous artboard. There's a pretty common thing you'll see is that a lot of times you have to do in Illustrator is move stuff around by duplicating it and moving it, and then you need to go back and clean it up before you're finished. So with this in mind, let's just go ahead and run this script. So again, I don't need to run this in debugger because it works for me. I'm just going to hit Control P and then hit Illustrator, and this should just pop up Illustrator for me. So you didn't see it, but it went through and grabbed the artwork, and then it went through. This was really, really quick. I should actually, let me do this again. Let's do more assets this time. So let's create, let's do 100 boards. We'll do save, and we'll do run in Illustrator. So it happened so fast you didn't really catch it, but it went through and automatically made all these artboards in a new document, and then it's going through and selecting pieces of art and applying them to this board. Now, there's a couple of things with this script that could probably be cleaned up better. The first is that you'll see in some cases there's only one piece of art on the board. Now, it's actually not one piece of art. It's actually 2 pieces, and it grabbed the same element. So this will get pretty complicated if you want to sort of have like a no repeating elements. What I would say is if you start with like 100 pieces and you're only going to combine 3, you'll have less of this happen. Because we have so few elements and we're grabbing them randomly, it's going to grab a lot of repeats. So this is the first thing I would probably fix if I were to take this a little bit further. But you'll see here, like it did generate different patterns, right? In some cases, I've got a triangle and a circle. I've got a triangle and a star. I've got just an image. I've got an image plus a vector. So the script will go through and grab everything in your preceding document. So basically, this is another thing to note here is only have one document open at a time. It's not smart enough to yet figure out what your active document is. So only have one of your collage documents open, and it'll generate a new file here. So a really cool thing you can do is now that you've got all these in artboards, you can go ahead and move them around, right? So let's say I don't like this combination here, so I want to move this here. You could do it manually, or you could start to begin to play with the script to generate it. The other nice thing is I like having all this on one artboard just to sort of see like what the diversity looks like. But you can also do a thing of just, I believe, save as. Let's see if this works. Cancel. File export, export as, or export for screens, I guess. No, that's not it. One of these is export as. Yes, let's use export as. You can use PNG, and then you can use artboards. And this is going to, if I just say test 1, and let me stick this in a folder so I can delete the folder. Test folder. If I just hit return here and hit OK, and I don't know where that folder actually went off to. Let me look this up. So it's actually generating each of these as a PNG. I could do it as a JPEG, I could do it as whatever. Oh, and you also see that it actually doubled my resolution. So you could maybe do this at a lower resolution, which may be better for you, and then just double it using exports. But this is a way to now generate all of these artboards iteratively while also still having access to them in Illustrator to edit them individually if you wanted to. So I knew Esteban's next question was going to be, how do I make this random and how do I like make things really wild and crazy? So let me stop that export. Let me just delete this folder. I don't know where that folder went off. It's fine. I have another thing in here called transforms. And if I set this to true, right now this does sort of like everything is chaos, which I'll show you an example of why this isn't the best thing in the world. But down here inside of if transforms, so I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm going to make every vector, if it's a path item, so if it's a vector path, I'm going to randomly change the color of each vector to a random color. It's very random right now. It'll be kind of garish, but it'll work. I'm going to then also rotate every piece of art, And then I'm also going to scale. And scale is a little confusing because there's a scale from center and there's also a scale from, by default, it scales from the top left. So I have to do some math in here in this function to scale from the center. But this is going to do like some really crazy random stuff. So again, this is a case of where we'll see in a second, but even with just a couple elements, I'm generating like a really crazy sort of layout using this. So I'm going to go in here. I'm going to delete this because I actually don't really want this file. And I'm going to run this script. And we can leave it at 100. That seems fine. So we'll go ahead and did I turn transform to true? I did. So I'm going to run this again. Quickly jump over to Illustrator. And now you'll see I'm randomly generating colors, I'm randomly generating rotation, and I'm randomly scaling everything. So there's one problem here, which is that when you actually export these out as PNGs, anywhere where it overlaps is going to be included, which is maybe good, maybe bad. There's probably a way to actually generate a mask to mask everything. I could look into doing that code. I just didn't feel like it this weekend because it was going to be a pain in the ass. But so now here we're getting to a place where like now we also have randomly generated colors and other things. So now realistically, this looks like a very different data set, right? All of those repeats are sort of gone. Now it's not perfect because you probably want more control over your color, or you probably want more control over other things. And this is where you can play with a little bit with what's in this transform. So this transform literally does anything within 360 rotation. So if you wanted it to be less, like let's say you only want 90-degree rotation, you could set it to 90. The scale could be anywhere from 0 to 2. So if you wanted it to be less, this is where it gets into sort of like some interesting territory. If you want it to be, let's say between between 0.5 and 1.5, I believe what you have to do is 2 plus, sorry, it's like one, I forget like what, there's math here to like actually like manipulate between a range. But yeah, you'd have to like play with that. So there's a bunch you can play with in here to do more. And there's probably even more you can play with in this that I haven't even really considered. But there's a lot of options. I think also, let's see if this works. I believe that if you group things together, so let me actually just add another circle here. So let's do control. Let me do this. So I believe if I group these two together, I believe it works with groups, but let me double check. Let's just run this and see. Yeah, so it takes groups as individual elements. So if you group a bunch of things together, those will act as one unit. So there's a lot of opportunities here to play with this and just sort of like experiment to see with what you can get out of it. But it's not perfect. It definitely requires a little bit of updating and tweaking. But I think it's a pretty interesting script and allows you to sort of create elements that are a little more fun and playful. And obviously I made these really like crappy sort of like stars and whatnot. Obviously someone like Esteban has like much nicer looking vectors, but there's a lot to play with in this script to see what you can generate. Esteban, I'm guessing you're gonna have questions.
I love it, man. Congratulations.
Okay.
Fantastic. Fantastic. No, really, really,
Cool.
really great. Both of them, the Photoshop one and this one.
Cool.
The only question that I have is like, there's any way that we can add more elements in the first part? Like, can we do like unlimited shapes and colors?
Yeah, pretty much. If you add a new artboard, or like, honestly, even if you stick it on the same artboard, let me just copy paste. There we go. So even if you, you can stick elements on the same screen, or you can actually just generate a new artboard of different elements. So like, you know, we could even go in here and just do like something funky like that. And then you can rerun it. It's basically like, it's meant to be extensible, right? So a lot of my code is written so that we can add new elements and it should still work. So if we actually do this, this should still work and it'll just add those new elements into our setup. Did it? Yeah, it did. So again, this should work that basically if your base file has any number of other assets, you can do that. Now, starting to see it get a little slow and janky here, and I'm not sure why that is. It might be an error. It's possible that it like hits something it doesn't know how to work with. Or it's just gonna, here's the other thing about Illustrator scripting is sometimes it crashes. So save your files. The nice thing is you can just repeat it. Oh boy. Did that finish? Let's see if that finished. I think Illustrator just crashed on me. So it can be a little buggy. This is a great example of how we need to force quit. So there might be a limit to the number of elements we can add. I don't know why exactly it crapped out. Sometimes it just craps out if you run the same script over and over and over again. It just like fills up the memory bank of these applications, and you run into issues with that. So sometimes I recommend if you're going to run a big complicated script, you like restart your Illustrator before doing it. But yeah, it's a bit of a challenge to sort of play with these things. Other questions you have, Esteban?
Do we have to prepare the first file ourselves, or are you going to provide us like the guidelines to create the first file and then out of that one generate all the graphics?
It's up to you. Honestly, like if you want me to send you this file, I can. The only thing to note is that the size of your artboard matters. So right now, these are all 1024 by 1024 artboards. If you have one artboard that's like 1024 and another that's like 760 by 760, I'm not sure the math is going to work out. So all I would say is like your artboard should be the same size in this file. I'll send you this file if you're interested in just using this, but like it doesn't really matter what file you use. As long as you have one file open and the artboards are all the same size. And there's probably some complicated thing, again, because I really haven't tested this too much. My guess is if something like is like this, like off the screen, it might not be caught. There's a bunch of like weird little edge cases where you have to think about it. But in general, I would say if you have all of your art is like completely contained inside the artboard, it'll probably work fine. I do want to just run a really quick example of, let's say you want to make 1,000 pieces. I do want to show that this will generate multiple document files, which is kind of confusing, but it's like the only way you can make it work. So this is going to generate 5 Illustrator files because there's a max limit to the page. So I'll let this run for a little bit while I answer other questions.
Amazing. It's great.
Mm-hmm. Are there other questions from folks? Cool. So those are the 2 scripts. I have many other scripts if you're interested, or if you like, I have an idea of automating this thing. How do I do it? I'm happy to talk through that. Either shoot me a DM of what you're trying to do, or drop a note in our Slack channel, or show up to one of the co-working sessions, and I'm happy to sort of talk through those things. But yeah, this was both a headache and a lot of fun. I'm definitely going to be using some of these scripts myself. So this is, again, I think Nauko and Esteban and I were talking about this. Like, I like doing these classes because they kick my ass and actually make me do shit. So I went ahead and did this shit for Esteban mostly, but now it works. So now we can play with it more. And I'll probably try to update this one maybe in the next, I probably won't get to it in the next couple weeks because we got a style guide class that starts up soon. But I'll probably try to update this with like an asking function or something to be able to mask out our features a little bit more. So this is now on page 3. It's still generating away. I'm probably going to stop this because this is, I don't know, this is driving me a little insane. It is kind of crazy. You have to watch this work. I'm actually just going to stop sharing my screen and see everyone else's faces. Yeah, so you can do that for Illustrator, Photoshop. There's a lot of people doing this for After Effects, those sort of things. So if you're interested, let me know. All right, so that is it. That's everything I have for class. I did it in just about the perfect amount of time. I hope you really enjoyed this class. I think for most of you, I'm going to see you in the style guide class, which will be great. And if you have any other questions, like please feel free to DM me or Leah, and we'll work through some things. Last thing is there is the end of class survey that Leah sent out. Please fill it out. We really appreciate feedback on that.
Could you give us an idea of what type of scripts do you have?
Oh boy. No, that's a great question. Let me see what's in here. So I probably have other scripts around if people are interested. The Adobe one is mostly, so if you see anything AI underscore, actually you can't see my screen, can you? Let me share my screen again. Cool, so anything that is AI underscore, oh geez. Anything that's AI underscore is basically like an Illustrator sort of documentation script. So those will just sort of give you examples of how to use things like fonts or how to use things like shapes. I try to name all my files to be like somewhat clear what they do, because a lot of times I come back to them years later and I'm like, what's going on in here? I would imagine that many of these are probably not super helpful for people, but if they exist, there's like, I've got some things where I like number every path item that is in a file. outlining fonts automatically. There's one that's on circle packing, which is kind of just fun to play with and it might be interesting to look at. I would say a lot of these probably have pieces that are worth like copying and pasting out of them, but are not like the most like immediately out of the box useful for you. Because I tend to build these like very specifically to my workflow. Acid blot, so let's actually see. This one might show how to do, actually, you know what? This probably just like takes an image and converts it to, let's see what this one does. Oh, so there's also this thing of where like there's menu commands that already exist inside of Illustrator. And a lot of times what you need to do is you actually need to access the menu command and do a thing with the menu. So there is a thing that just executes commands. So a common thing you'll see me do is I'll just select everything on the page and ungroup it. Because a lot of times I just want individual ungrouped files. And then I go through a thing. So I think what does this do? This is, I don't know what this does. Find fill color menu, group. Oh, this does Pathfinder. So if you're interested in like automating a Pathfinder script, like taking an image and automatically like outlining it, this will do some of that. It also does a thing where this is a thing called round color, which basically takes the color of the image and tries to round it to like a really regular value, like 0 to 1 or middle of 1 to generate like really primary colors in RGB. So I'd just say like generally just dig around and see what's what in here. Some of it is helpful, some of it isn't. So if you're interested in something you want to figure out how to do it, like let me know. I don't know that, I feel like I have many other scripts in other places that have disappeared. There's a lot you can do in Illustrator scripting, including like, you can include other files as like this is like getting into like the coding world where you might have like a file of just functions and you want to include all your functions from that file in here. There's a way to do that. There's a bunch of other things within Adobe scripting that get pretty crazy. I don't even think I have, actually, let me see if I do have the, what is this? Oh, if you're interested in trying to figure out how to actually, you can do web URLs. You can scrape a web URL and grab all the assets from it and bring it into a file. If you're interested in that, that's the sockets.jsx thing, which is pretty crazy. I don't even know if this still works today, but it should. What is this? I don't know. There's a bunch of files in here. But yeah, if you're ever interested in, you can dig around in here and sort of see different things.
Well, when can we start playing with the scripts?
All the links are in the deck, and like basically the stuff's already uploaded, so it's already up on GitHub. So if you just go to dbschultz/Adobe Hut, all this stuff already exists up here. So you could start playing with it now if you wanted to. And all the slides, I believe, are already linked to in our files. So the slides are already up on the class site. Video will go up, in the next hour or two. So you can go ahead and dig around and start playing with it now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Amazing.
Yeah, of course.
Amazing. Yeah.
Any other questions from folks? Cool. All right. Well, we're going to do one more co-working session next week. So if you want to hang out for those, let us know. And then if you haven't set up a one-on-one with us yet, please do, and we'll talk more there.
I would love to share some stuff during that co-working session,
Yeah, totally, of course.
What happened, if that worked or not. Yeah,
I'm sure you will find many edge cases, and I will try to figure out how to not break things. So yeah.
Cool.
Cool. All right. Well, if there's no more questions, thanks everybody. This has been a really fun class. I hope you found some good value out of it and you learned a lot. And I think I'm seeing many of you next week for the Style Gang class. Lee's going to send an email with the latest news about that probably the next day or two. So hopefully see you all this time next week. Cool. All right. Have a great rest of your night, everybody.